It's a late winter's day on a small mountain farm near Burnsville. The kind of day that gets your hopes up, despite the lingering snow. And the sap is rising, a sure sign of approaching spring, as it drips from the tap on this maple tree. Sap from a maple tree? In North Carolina? You bet. Welcome to Maple Creek Farm, our state's only commercial producer of real maple syrup. It all started a few years ago when John Swan bought a piece of mountain property here that he thought would be a great place to retire someday.
I just had this idea that we could get a farm going up here, and so I advertised for a farm manager and came upon Richard and Molly. Richard has a master's degree in forestry from Duke, and one of the first things he did is hike up and down the mountains and just kind of scope out everything we have on the farm. And he came back down and said, we got massive amounts of maple trees, sugar maple trees. Why don't we try doing some syrup?
So this here is a bucket, what's called a bucket tap, and this tree is the closest tree to the house. And it's also gets southern sun, so when the sun comes up in the morning, if this tree's running, I know to expect all the other trees to start running.
The challenge that was always in the mountains down here is you can't get the sap down to the evaporator very easily. Up north you could get a sleigh and a horse through the woods because the grades were not as bad, but up here with the rocks and the trees, we tried the first year with buckets and it was a disaster. There's nothing like carrying 2 5-gallon buckets of sap down a rocky hill in the mud to convince you real quick that that's not feasible on any kind of scale.
After studying techniques now being used in Vermont, Richard rigged a system of tubes that lets gravity do all the work getting the sap down the mountain to collecting tanks.
This black line is what we call our main line, and it is hanging on 10-gauge high tensile electric fence wire. So we probably got 2 miles of this. This is what really transports all of our sap. Then we bought some of this blue tubing. It's food grade maple sap tubing, and it's flexible, and we run it from tree to tree. What we're looking for in a tappable tree is something with a big healthy crown, something bigger than 12 inches in general. But what we're actually doing is we're going to take a drill bit and drill in and sever the vascular cells that are moving liquid up and down through the tree. And then we stick in this little tap here, hammer it in tight, and let it seal around the outside of that hole so that any liquid in there backs up and runs out through this little plastic tap into our tubing system. When it warms up to a nice warm day, say 40, 45, 50, the sap begins to move up the tree trunk. But it needs a freezing night to make the tree trunk contract and push the sap back down into the root systems. So what we really want is a 20-degree night to a 50-degree day every day for a week. We're collecting sap from maybe 400 trees on the property, and we've strung about 4 miles of tubing, and we collect it here. Sap, especially in warm weather, sap will spoil pretty quick. There are bacteria that like to eat the sugar. So the best thing for us to do is to turn it into syrup just as fast as we can.
You want to bring me an armload of some bigger stuff, Richard?
And that's when another bit of New England technology is put to good use. An evaporator that stands in all its stainless steel glory 1 level below the storage tanks.
It's kind of hard to find one of these things in North Carolina. John and I drove to New Hampshire after our first year of production, and we decided it was worth investing in this really very specialized piece of equipment. This whole unit's called a continuous flow evaporator. Sap runs from our storage tank into this copper pipe, and it's going to be at close to freezing usually when we start up. And it runs back and forth through these copper pipes here. And all these pipes are bathed in hot steam.
Once the fire gets fully cranked, the sap can be boiling in about 20 minutes, but then takes constant attention to both the fire and the condition of the sap. As the sap winds its way back and forth through the evaporator channels, it gets sweeter and sweeter, from 2% sugar at the start to 67% sugar after most of the water is evaporated. At its peak, water evaporates at the rate of 40 gallons an hour. It will be several hours now before the pure maple syrup is ready to be drawn off in small batches. John's goal is to make Maple Creek Farm financially self-sufficient, so maple syrup is only one of their enterprises. There's always a dozen or so of these plump characters around to assure a steady supply of popular pork products.
We do pastured pork and lamb, as well as sorghum syrup, as well as the maple syrup, and seasonal vegetables, and a little bit of apple cider.
These Dorper sheep are well suited to mountain life.
The Dorper sheep were bred specifically for meat production and have a really rich, mild meat. And they do really well on poor quality pasture, which we have a lot of.
So we raise them for lamb to produce up to 6 lambs per ewe every 2 years. So we have about 30 ewes now, and we breed them in the fall and we lamb in the spring, and then we'll start selling lamb meat this fall.
Back at the evaporator, the first batch of syrup is ready.
Yep, right at it. Over there. Okay, we're gonna draw off then. We're just gonna crack that valve a little bit. Let it pour on.
This process of drawing off a small amount at a time continues until there's a practical amount to be bottled. Maple Creek Farm defies the bigger is better idea of farming. Their success is measured in demand for fresh from the farm, locally grown products of superior quality. Maple syrup in spring and sorghum syrup in the fall are sold at local farmers markets and are available directly from the farm as well.
Increasingly in this market, the consumer likes to know where their food comes from. They like to go to the market each week and know the farmer and know the story behind the food. There's a comfort level in knowing where your food comes from and the conditions under which it was grown.
So, if you want the real thing, right here is where to find it. And we hear it goes pretty well with some of that homegrown sausage, too.